Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. We are so excited to have you here with us for what will be the first part in our 5-part webinar series that we're going to hold this month to explore the integration of health into transportation planning and practice. Today, we're lucky to be joined by a diverse group of planning and public health professionals who have issued a call to action for fundamentally shifting the way we plan, build, program, advocate, and legislate for transportation in our communities to prioritize health and quality of life for everyone. As a critical first step, we have to reflect on where we've fallen short, reimagine approaches to mobility that center on equity and justice, and reconstruct systems that include and lift up communities who have been excluded and harmed. I'm so excited about this episode and the whole series, and I'm glad you're here with us to hear the conversation and be part of it. I have a little bit of housekeeping that I wanted to get into to kick things off and then make way for our panelists to really get into their material. You won't be able to speak during the webinar as attendees, but you will be able to communicate with us by submitting questions and comments as we go. Please submit questions as you have them, and I'm going to hold maybe 20 to 30 minutes at the end where we're going to ask our panelists to respond to those questions and weigh in on some of the things you're wondering about. We do have a webinar archive page where we'll post all the material related to this webinar. You can find it at pedbikeinfo.org/webinars. I'm going to send out another link to you shortly. You'll find the webinar recording after the presentation is done. You'll find some resources that the panelists have provided and that we'd like to share, including a framework that we'll share in a minute to help guide this conversation. That's also where you can find a copy of the slides we're sharing today and a lot of other information. So please visit that page. If you are looking for a live transcript for today's webinar, you can find that at a link that is on the screen and of which I will send out through the chat momentarily. We've had this webinar approved for 1.5 CM credits for planners. So if you're used to claiming those, please go to the AICP website and you can do that there. We'll be sending out certificates of completion after this webinar for 1.5 hours of instruction. So you can use those to report your hours for professional development. I'm going to send a follow-up email later today, which will include all the links we've talked about already. It'll include some information about how you can sign up and find out more information about the upcoming webinars we have, including the 4 remaining episodes in this series that'll be coming later this month. Since this is the first episode in this series, I wanted to give you a preview of what else we're going to be covering in this webinar series on health and transportation. You see some of the key dates and topics that we're planning to cover here on this slide. We know that transportation and health intersect in many ways, and that transportation infrastructure and services and related policies and designs have been identified as key factors influencing or determining our health status. Part of what motivated this series came from our work on a recent NCHRP report that produced a research roadmap for transportation and health. We asked some questions during that study, and there are questions continuing to be raised and will be discussed throughout this series, like how are health and equity defined within the transportation community? How can practice impact health? In what ways are transportation agencies considering health and practice? And what partnerships, research, and other resources are needed to improve practice? And we'll dwell on these as we move through this series. And there are many pathways that transportation practitioners can take to improve public health. We'll be discussing the ways that transportation agencies are partnering with other organizations, integrating data, changing processes, and practices related to transportation project selection. But none of these practices can be explored without also acknowledging the disparities in health and transportation that can be observed today, examining what has gotten us here and setting a vision for the work needed to build more equitable and inclusive transportation and health practices. And so we begin our series today with 4 panelists who have been answering the call to interrogate, the role of power and privilege and sharing their efforts and ideas for creating more healthy and equitable communities. And I'd like to now introduce you to the panelists joining us today. First, we're joined by Odetta Mcleish White, who's the Managing Director of the Transformation Alliance, a partnership of nonprofits, government agencies, and businesses working to strengthen communities through transit. TFA's work is driven by racial equity and seeks to partner with residents of impacted communities in shaping better health, climate, and economic outcomes through arts and culture-based community engagement and by improving housing, transit, and jobs access. We're so grateful to have Odetta joining us today. We're also joined by Tamika Butler, who's a national expert and speaker on issues related to the built environment, equity, anti-racism, diversity and inclusion, organizational behavior, and change management. As the principal and founder of Tamika L. Butler Consulting, she focuses on shining a light on inequality, inequity, and social justice. Most recently, she was Director of Planning in California and the Director of Equity and Inclusion at Tool Design. Previously, Tamika served as the Executive Director of the Los Angeles Neighborhood Land Trust, a nonprofit organization that addresses social and racial equity and wellness by building parks and gardens in park-poor communities across greater Los Angeles. Tamika has a diverse background in law, community organizing, and nonprofit leadership. We're so excited to have Tamika joining us as well. Vidette Gavin is a health equity futurist. She has committed her career to cultivating the research, strategy, and leadership in communities and institutions to create conditions where people and communities of color are well and thriving. She's got 19 years of experience in public health, research, public engagement, and systems change strategy. She's currently the founder and principal at Verge Impact Partners, LLC, and is the co-principal investigator of the Healthy Neighborhood Study with MIT. She serves as the vice chair of the Black Women's Health Imperative and is founding board member of the Center for Achieving Equity. Thank you, Vidette, for joining us today. And we're also joined by Veronica Davis, is a self-described transportation nerd. She believes all people should have access to safe, reliable, and affordable transportation. Veronica has 19 years of experience in civil engineering and planning and is currently the partner and principal planning manager at Inspire Green LLC. She's one of the co-founders of Black Women Bike and serves on the board for America Walks. So we have an excellent panel. I don't want to spend any more time getting in the way of their comments and their conversation. So I'd like to now turn it over to Odetta Mcleish White to really help moderate and lead this discussion today. And Odetta, it's all yours.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dan, for that wonderful set of introductions. And as I will always say, time spent with these ladies is time well spent. So I'm excited to just settle in and have a conversation with my beloved friends here today. Everyone, Dan did a great job telling you all what Veronica, Vidette, Tamika, and I do. But we wanted to first talk a little bit about why we do what we do and who we are in the space. So I believe we offered 3 words per person to talk a little bit about, how we would even talk about who we are. Dan, I think you have those words. I would be happy to model a little bit of that, and then we'll just, I'll call on my friends to talk further. Can we go back to the slide with the 3 words, Dan? Thank you. So, complex, collaborative, and important. Yes, I am important, but I was really thinking about the importance of the work that I do with Transformation Alliance, which is a 35-member collaborative working here in Metro Atlanta. It is so critical that we find connection points and intersections, and my value structure as I move through life has become clearer and clearer about what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said is the web of mutuality that binds all of us, and the fact that no one is free until all of us are free. And so one of those powerful things for me, working with the 3 people that are joining me on this panel, but also others, has been kind of the space of liberation that we have been able to create together. And that when we do that, we often come up with options that folks didn't think about before, or maybe hadn't understood were possible to them. So for me, complexity is something to be embraced. It can be exhausting, which is why you need joy and restoration and naps on naps on naps to get through it and get through it well. And you do that so that you can collaborate deeply and authentically with your colleagues and loved ones and friends in the important work of breaking down systems that were not meant for many of us to thrive. They were not created for us to thrive. So that's just a little insight into, and I would be remiss if I didn't also always ground my work deeply in, frankly, the physical safety of my loved ones. I have a Black husband, a Black son, and a Black daughter. All of them are vulnerable in our society, and I believe our current society is losing out on the wonderful gifts that my children and husband have to offer, because we are too much consumed with protecting them instead of teaching them to fly and be free and do all they can. So I work to create a world in which my son and daughter can live out their purpose and be who they want to be without fear of physical harm or death. here in America. So that's a little bit about me and my 3 words. We kind of have a little bit of a set order for other parts of the panel, so I'm going to break away from that just a bit for now, and I will ask Veronica to talk a little bit about her 3 words and why you do what you do.
Good afternoon, everyone. So one of my words is complex as well, but for different reasons than Odetta, political and communicative. So for me, complex, I am an engineer, and design is complex, but then again, it really isn't. Usually everything is defined for us. You have a defined amount of space that you're working in. You have design standards and guidelines that you have to stay within in order to do a design. But what really makes my work complex is once you add people in, because everyone has different opinions of how that 60 feet, sometimes less, of right-of-way is used. One person may want a tree, one person wants a bike lane, someone wants to park their car right in front of their house, and you have all these competing things, and there's trade-offs. And so it makes my work, that is what makes my work complex. Political kind of falls into that. Is my work is very political, because once you add people, it naturally goes to politics. When people get upset, they call their mayor, they call their elected representative to fight for them. And so then now you have politicians involved in sometimes very much engineering decisions. And I have plenty of projects that are sitting on someone's hard drive and will be there forever more in a day and live in the cloud and never to be actually implemented. But it is very political, and understanding the politics, not just of wherever you're working, but also the politics of that neighborhood, and sometimes the politics of that block. I had a neighborhood where I worked in where there was the unofficial mayor, and if that unofficial mayor wasn't happy and wasn't supportive, the whole block was not going to be happy or supportive. So being able to really understand the power structure at all levels. And lastly, communicative. I am an engineer who knows how to talk to people. And it is a large joke within the engineering community, because most engineers, if they never had to talk to the public, they would be perfectly happy. But I do like talking with people, because that's ultimately why I'm in this profession. You know, civil engineering roots on the fact of civil society and making sure society has what it needs, whether it's fresh water, whether it's the ability to move, whether it's structures for them to live or work or play in. And so that is why I do what I do. And I'm excited to be on this panel, and I'm always excited to be with 3 of my favorite people on the world.
Hey, Odetta, give us a little insight into your 3 words.
Thanks so much, Odetta, and just echoing you and Veronica, it's a joy to be with you ladies again. We'll share a little bit about how we all came together in this work after our introductions, but these colleagues continue to be people who kind of helped me demonstrate the first word that I chose, which is alchemy, in the process of turning lead into gold. And so I think of myself as a social alchemist, working with groups of people who have been left behind, marginalized, communities and places that have been left behind, disinvested, and working together with people to turn those places into thriving, vibrant places. I'm a public health strategist who's an organizer at heart. I've been organizing since I was about 3 years old, the granddaughter of a civil rights activist and organizer. And so I spent my childhood going door to door to door, hearing what different families needed in our neighborhood, and working together through our church, through our community centers, to build housing, to create grocery stores, to create businesses, to provide local transportation, to do all the things that we need to be a thriving and vibrant community. And so for me, this work really is about the power of people working together to transform their own places and families and lives into places that can support them. And recognizing I'm a Columbus, Ohio native and have grown up kind of in the Northeast Ohio, Michigan, Pittsburgh area in the Rust Belt, turning lead to gold really does have symbolic significance for me, particularly when we think about health as being the culmination of everything that we're exposed to and experience every day. And so for me in the public health space, I work a lot with you all in the transportation space, because 70 to 80% of how well and how long people live is based on where they live, not the care that they have access to or the quality of the care that they receive. And so for me, this is such a significant opportunity to create spaces and places where people can thrive. And my second word here is strategic. And for me, that means that this work is really about decision making. I think good population health work, good public health work is around being future oriented, being perceptive, being connected to communities and understanding what people need to be well at a large level, and then being proactive. And so it involves sometimes creating the opportunities, ripening opportunities, introducing new frameworks and galvanizing new coalitions to bring something to the forefront that necessarily wasn't a priority before, and making these significant investments to improve health. And then lastly, I just deeply believe that people are powerful. And I think that, you know, all of the major gains that we have made in my tenure in the public health space, you know, thinking about transportation laws, traffic safety, tobacco cessation, you know, de-leading houses, kind of all of those major population level things have been because of the power of coalitions and advocates. And so you can't, for me, divorce this work from the power of the people who come together to do it. And so those are the three words that I like to share. That's why I come to this work. And I'm so looking forward to this conversation with you ladies today.
Fabulous. And Tamika, principal and founder of Tamika L. Butler Consulting. So now we add entrepreneur to your list of accomplishments. Tell us about your three words.
You're muted, Tamika.
How about now? Had to do
Gotcha.
it once. Odetta, thank you. You're everybody's favorite hype woman, and I really appreciate everybody's patience. This is a webinar in the time of COVID, so I'm like, you know, dealing with kids, turning off camera, coming back, but I'm here, and I'm here because I really, really appreciate this group of folks. You know, we're hitting the anniversary of when we all came together and when we all met. And I think the last time we got together, I picked 3 different words. But this time I picked Black, queer, aesthetic. And I think for me, it's just because everything I'm doing in this work is with that aesthetic. I am Black, I am queer. I'm originally from the Midwest. And I think when we think about this work, too often folks try to come to their work and say work is work and personal is personal. And I think that is a privilege for you to be able to do that. But for me, as a genderqueer Black woman, I have to bring that to everything I do. Work is personal, and that's just what it is. I am from ancestors who are still like looking out for us as we try to get free. And so as I come to work, whether or not it's the facilitation of a meeting, whether or not it's the designing of a bike lane, whether or not it's in one-on-one conversation with somebody, I'm Black. And so when something happens, when we are still unable to charge the killers of Breonna Taylor, when it is Indigenous Peoples Day and there are still folks afraid to acknowledge the stolen land they are living on, when there are different things happening, I have to bring all of that to my conversation. I have to bring all of that to my interactions, and I have to bring all of that to the work that I'm doing, because I know that my son's life depends on it. I know that my life depends on it. I know that the people who I love and care about and who look like me and who have been through the things I've been through, their life depends on it. And so I'm not someone who says, well, let's put an equity lens on this. Lenses are things that you can take on and off, right? And I'm not trying to take it on or off. I'm trying to just be authentically who I am and say that this is what we have to bring to all of our work, all of the time. And that's just how we approach. That's how we approach this. You're gonna get, what you're gonna get. Just because we can code switch and switch it up doesn't mean we are different people. Doesn't mean we are bringing something different. And so I would challenge folks who like to think that work is work and personal is personal to realize that for some of us, we are not privileged to separate the two, nor would we want to. And we're bringing all of ourselves to all that we do. And so I will stop there.
Awesome. Thank you, Tamika. You have set up the next session in next section, and also a little bit later when we talk a little bit about the framework and how we can combine all of these parts of ourselves into tackling different pieces of the framework. So thank you. So what you helped set up for just this next part is Salzburg. My Facebook page memories are starting to fill up with my posts about the travel to Salzburg and, you know, beautiful pictures of the Schloss, which Leopoldhalder, to this day, I can't pronounce it, but it was beautiful. The Sound of Music Palace. And hopefully folks are already getting a sense of the connection the four of us have, and we share it with others who happen to not be in this particular conversation. But maybe now we could talk a little bit and kind of help them understand why we are so connected to one another. We spent a lot of time together in that week tackling some tough stuff. So it's really kind of, you know, appropriate that in the anniversary, the 2-year anniversary of getting to know each other, we are convened here to talk a little bit. You know, for me, what I've said before to you all is that I came into the Salzburg experience, the global seminar, frankly, from a pretty ego-based place. I felt very validated by the invitation from Robert Wood Johnson, and they're paying for me to go, and I'm going to be in, you know, this fabulous locale. And it was a very I-centered kind of attitude about, you know, what am I going to experience and how will I network and what might this lead to next for me? And it was the first night that we were there that we sort of walked right into some of the implicit and explicit bias that people bring into these conversations of community and healthy and inclusive communities. And it was right there in the cohort that we were about to spend the week with. And it was, for me, this immediate moment of, you know, choose this hour where you're going to be with this next week, right? And it was a brief decision. It was clear I needed to be with Tamika and Odetta and Veronica and the other Black women who were immediately calling out problematic attitudes and language. And then we gathered some other folks with us, or they were drawn to the discussion, and we'll talk about the framework in a moment. But I'd love to just hold some space, especially on our anniversary week, to talk about what Salzburg was like for each of us and how meeting in that space kind of alchemized our getting to know each other. You know, it turned what could have been just a dope professional experience for sure, but it turned into something greater than the sum of its parts because of the way we and others in the Defense Committee kind of snapped together and explored power and privilege that week. So it was just a really humbling and decentering experience for me, for which I'm really, really grateful, because being able to reach out and talk to all of you has just enriched me so much over the past 2 years. So I'm gonna make this a more open moment. Whoever would like to jump in and just talk about Salzburg and what it meant, and we will shape up for everybody listening how the Defense Committee came together as we continue talking. But who'd like to talk a little bit about Salzburg?
Tamika,
go first.
Okay.
Oh, wait, go ahead, Tamika.
Veronica, after you.
Veronica.
So I'll say for me, I think that an important part of Salzburg itself is the fact that Tamika talked about stolen land. Salzburg itself, where we were, was stolen land, essentially. At one point in history, and just the physical building, it was owned by a person who was Jewish. And as part of everything happening with the Holocaust and the, essential occupation of Nazis, that the property where we physically stayed was taken over, and it was a place where the Nazis had used. And even walking around Salzburg, the plates in the ground, recognizing the people who used to live there before the Nazis came and took their property and took their lives, essentially. And so when I think about, kind of paralleling that back to the United States, and in us, it's the fact that our ancestors were stolen people, kidnapped essentially, and tried to be made property. And so just the physical space that we were in, you know, it sets up for a conversation about power and privilege, and who gets to define what. But I can also say it was very much a transformative experience for me. You know, I sat with many of you all by the lake, and so the Salzburg sits on this very peaceful and still lake. And there's something about that peaceful and stillness that it was a lot of time for just reflection, both personally, as you're talking about, Odetta, you know, from a professional perspective, but just as a person of what does this whole thing mean for me, and how do we move forward with it. And then you know, meeting people from around the world. And so you have language barriers, and that some people English wasn't their first language. And then you have professional barriers that even if English is our first language, we're still not speaking the same language. Just the definition of words and the importance of saying what you really mean and not talking how we try to do sometimes from this professional view is, you know, Tamika talked about code switching. We try to use all these words to not say what we mean versus just saying what we mean, right? So we'll say Black, Indigenous, people of color, or people of color when we're talking about Black people, but we don't want to say just Black people. So we come up with all of these ways to not talk about what we're really talking about, and realizing how that creates sometimes a friction in that we're not talking about the same thing, even though we're all speaking from the same language. So it was a lot. It was a very emotional experience, and I'm very happy that I had it at the time that I had that experience.
Yeah, I would say, you know, to Veronica's point about the history of the place, to the Nazi occupation, you know, I've taken a few trips to Israel. I've studied a bit about the Holocaust, and I think one of the things that is so jarring when you read about it or study about it is the way in which for so long people just didn't speak up because they didn't realize the scope of what was happening, or they realized it but it didn't impact them, right? And I think we've seen points in history where that pattern repeats itself. And I think what was so interesting is to be in that space with that history, and then as Black women who were there, to experience that whenever we would try to raise an issue about building a healthy, equitable community, which was the theme of the session, we were repeatedly told, well, that's an American thing. Well, more specifically, that's an American Black thing. And then more specifically, that American white guy over there isn't complaining about this. So this must be an American Black woman thing, right? That Black American guy isn't complaining about this. So this just must be something you Black women are facing. And the number of times that we spoke up about the way that when you are trying to build healthy, equitable communities, racism shows up, anti-Blackness shows up. The number of times we talked about the way that whether or not you are a researcher, a public health professional, a transportation professional, a parks professional, you know, this convening had it all, an architect. We had all of the professions there, right? And no matter how many times we said, no matter what your job is, no matter what your role in this building environment, there are times where your profession is complicit in racism. And the people would just keep saying to us, that's in your head. If you don't like it, why don't you just leave America? It's not like that in where I'm from. It's not like that in my country. And I think the way that we continue to have people essentially say to us, this doesn't impact me, so it's not a problem, was baffling. Not surprising, but baffling, right? And baffling because they couldn't see that connection. And so I think what was so powerful about that space is that it was no different than any other space where the Black women and specifically Black women from across the world, right? We had folks in our crew that were from South Africa, right? It wasn't just Black women in the United States who were all together and were all sharing instances of pain and racism that we had experienced in life, wherever we were from, but that we were experiencing in the few days we were there together. that we just experienced in line getting lunch, at the table in the workshop, right? And so I think what was so affirming is that we were able to come together, we were able to support each other, we were able to uplift each other. But also, as the workshop, the whole style of the workshop is like the facilitators kind of let the participants run things. And so it could fall apart or it can come back together. But when it came back together, who were facilitating those sessions? Who were leading those sessions? Black women, and often Black American women. And so it was this setting where, once again, everyone else wanted to tear things down, but you rely on Black women to build it up. You don't want necessarily their expertise or their opinions, but you want their work, you want their labor. And I think we were able to support each other in that. We were able to feel validated and seen in all of that. But what we experienced many years ago in Salzburg, while beautiful, while it brought us together, while I experienced great, tremendous growth, I think it also reminded all of us that the work we care passionately about, whether or not it's biking, whether or not it's walking, whether or not it's, healthcare, whatever it is, we are still Black women. And there are still folks who want to see us at the table because they want our pretty diverse, ageless faces, but they don't want to necessarily hear our opinions, and they will do everything to dismiss you, to tell you you're angry, to tell you you're overreacting, to tell you that you're holding on to past harm when they're not racist. And they will do everything they can to throw you off your game. And it's how we held each other up to persevere. And so that's what I think about when I think about Salzburg. And I think about how it continued to push our work forward and how much we all do together now as we continue to support one another.
Yeah, Odetta, before you jump in, I just want to add too, we did all of that and we brought intellectual power to the conversation. Like that, I think too, what for me the Salzburg moment brought forth was that completeness, right? Like I wasn't there to just be a professional. Like so much of me was called forth, right, and demanded that to be expressed, including tremendous intellect and ability to analyze and walk together as equals in using our brains and our experiences. It was really powerful. Odetta, jump on in. What Salzburg mean to you?
I think just to fill in, I guess, some of the story. The Salzburg Global Fellowship convenes delegate teams from different countries from around the world to come together to talk about a big issue that the world is facing. People all over the world, regardless of where they live, are facing. And our topic was developing healthy and equitable communities. And I think as Veronica and Odetta and Tamika shared, we got there, the American delegation, we didn't all know one another, and we were from many, many different disciplines. And as we began to interact with one another and people from around the world, we went through sessions on, with the folks who invented the health impact assessment. And we went through sessions with folks who, from the Netherlands, who have, derived expert, bike systems and green buildings and sustainability practices. And the thing that was unspoken and or dismissed from the table and or deemed not a part of the work for equitable communities was thinking about in each country who was marginalized. And none of us were achieving optimal health, but the one thing we didn't want to talk about was like, what's that distribution like? And so in my research hat, I'm constantly looking at this data from around the world going, yeah, but who's in the bottom 25%? What does your actual distribution look like? When you're showing me these improvements for whom? And, our delegation and those folks who gravitated towards the conversation around power and privilege really realized we can't make progress in our practice without talking about who's not at the table, who's left behind, because many of the solutions and case studies we were lifting up at the global level were not about communities that were excluded in any of those countries. And if they were often lifting up grassroots organizing initiatives as something separate and apart from our transformative systems level work, as we like to think of it, right? And so we saw really great examples from Brazil and from South America around, grassroots community-led wealth building and grassroots community-led health planning. But those things were separate and apart from the systems level work, from the government representatives, right? And so there was this like huge divide in our ability to even see and name the problem we were trying to solve and identify, you know, what we say in public health, the root causes of the issues that we were addressing around physical activity, around food deserts, around inequitable transportation, around education, around dilapidated housing. We couldn't get to the root that just says different groups of people hold different value in society because of caste globally. That was a hard conversation to have. And so for us, when we looked at that equity diagram, how did we get the name, the defense crew? You've all seen the equity versus equality diagram by now, where people are standing on the boxes, you know, and the children are trying to see over the fence. And our group kind of was saying our inability to talk about the differential value of human beings manifested by structural and systematic racism in the United States context, in caste and other places. Our inability to talk about that and to see that in the work that we're doing every day is the fence. And instead of trying to stack boxes, as Veronica was saying, using the language to not talk about what we're talking about, instead of us trying to derive all these processes to help people see over a fence, why don't we attack the systems that created and uphold the fence? And so we named ourselves the defense crew. And our goal was simply, in order for us to really move forward across disciplines to create healthy communities, we have to have a common ability to interrogate and properly wield and share and redistribute power. And so that, you know, I think was our fundamental common belief and common vision for the future that we feel is very achievable. And so then our group kind of said, well, for all of us who are architects and planners and public health folks who believe this is possible, what would be a great place to start? You know, how do we get other people to be able to have this conversation and dig into this work? And that led to the creation of the framework. So I'll kick it back to you with that, Odetta.
Odetta, can I jump in real quick?
Yes, please.
Okay, so it's something Vedette said and something Tamika said that I want to make sure I say to everyone listening on here, because I want you to hear what we are really saying. So part of it was, I think part of it is when we work with people, their opinion and their lived experience isn't treated as something that's real. And so for us as women, as Black women, you know, talking about, you know, the racism, all the isms, it was like, oh, no, that's not real. It's kind of like what Tamika was saying. Or what Vedette was saying is that, oh, there's no fence. Like, of course, everyone has, you know, everyone's going to get what they need, right? And those things are all beautiful. But the frustrating part about all of this was it was like 10 days that we were there, 9 days, however many days. We went through all of this, developed this framework, put all of our emotions into this to be able to create the framework of power and privilege. And even after all of that, it wasn't until one of the white male participants stood up and acknowledged the work that we did that everyone in the room was like, oh yes, bravo, 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 bravo. And so I say that because as many of you all are thinking about equity of power and privilege, and you're like, yes, let me get my, you know, my Black face in my group. It's when that person speaks, whether, you know, they are an expert, we are all experts in what we do. We are all experts in being Black. We're all experts in being women. But what we say has validation. And I don't need anyone else to co-sign the work that we are doing for it to feel valid. And when that is happening, when you are, because it was well-meaning people, but it wasn't, you know, people were just like, oh, shaking their heads like, okay, this is good. But why does a white man standing up to lift up our work then get us the applause that we needed? And I think for all of us, it was just like this emotional dump of the day. It was a lot of tears. I will say I cried, and I cried tears of frustration of putting all this emotional labor in, and it still wasn't enough. That's all I had to say. Okay, back to you.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure people are ramped up to see the framework now, but I also want to point out the defense crew because we like complexity, right? It's layered. It is both removing a fence, but we also, I think, were feeling that we wanted to defend one another, right? That in the space of producing this framework and sharing it and any of the other work we would do after we left Salzburg, that we were going to be there to help each other and defend our humanity from the very attacks and frustrations that Veronica just put forward. So defense has a lot of meanings the way we're applying it in this group, and we're just a portion of the team that kind of worked on this. But let's go now. So what we wanted to do was offer a quick poll before we kind of really present the framework and get into some of the sections. There are 3 sections. So just if you would take a moment, and hopefully you see it up in front of you, which sentiment best describes how you're feeling about confronting power and privilege in transportation planning. And you've got your 5 options there, from all the way from I'm ready to burn it down to I'm tired of talking about this. We want honesty. We want to know how people are managing 2020. So I think the poll is open. Please take a moment to select what best describes you, and then we'll see what the results are.
And I'll keep an eye. This is Dan. Keep an eye on how many have voted, and when that levels off, I'll close it and let y'all know. Hopefully, you can then see the results. We right now have about 60% of everyone has cast your vote, so please get those in. You can pick as many as. Oh, I'm sorry. You can pick as many as you as that apply to you.
Perfect. That's what I was about to say. Thank you, Dan. Because this is a complex discussion, you might be feeling many things. So click whatever works for you, as many as work for you.
At 70% voted, a few more coming in. Please go ahead and wrap those up. We'll close the poll in just a few more seconds. Okay, we've got about 80% and it's leveled off there. So let me close and share the results.
Excuse me.
Okay, hopefully you see that.
All right, burn it downers. That's solid. 33%, 37 are glad that we're finally talking about this. Overwhelmed, totally get that. Ready to learn, that's great. Awesome. And those who are tired of talking about this, I hear you, but take a walk in nature and come on back because we need to keep talking about it. Thank you so much, Dan, for that moment to give us as speakers a sense of kind of where people are in the conversation. So we wanted to talk now about the framework itself. And one, it's important to note that it is a call to action. It is a charge that we sent out to the intersectional community of inclusive and healthy communities and all the people that might touch something like that. So while it contains a lot of intellectual power and thought, it really is meant to suggest pathways of action. We also didn't want to overprescribe what things would be, right? How to do things, but we did outline 3 big areas around brave space, around power, and around privilege. Those are kind of the 3 portions of the 3 portions. So of the framework, and I think there's a link to it in the announcements section that's available to everyone. Dan, I apologize. Did we give you something to share?
Yep, I just sent a link. I just sent a link around in the chat pod, so folks should see it there, but it's also on our webinar archive page that the link was shared earlier.
Okay, great. So I invite people to pull that up, and as we sort of start talking about some of this. So Tamika, are you with us? At least by audio? There you are. All right, cool. So Tamika, I wanted to kind of start with you, if I could. Could you please, from your perspective as an advocate and a leader, executive director of organizations, talk a little bit about the brave space section of our framework, what it's intended to do, but really how you see some ways to operationalize it. How does the need for brave space show up in your world, and what are some of the ways we can actually operationalize that call to action of the framework?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think when we think about this work, a lot of us think about safe spaces. I remember being a young gay, and I had just come out and I went to my sister's college dorm room. She was older than me, and she was an RA, and she had that little pink triangle outside of her door that said she was an ally, and her room was a safe space. And I remember at the time thinking, man, it's so cool, the idea of a safe space. And I think for years, right, all of us have been saying, we want to create a safe space to talk about these things. We want to create a safe space for queer people, for women of color, for folks with disabilities, safe, safe, safe. And I think what we've really tried to push people to understand is that we're beyond that. Just like, frankly, we're beyond a little bit allies, and we can say more about that later, the difference between an ally and an accomplice. But if all you're trying to do is create a safe space, then you're not really going to accomplish this work. And what I try to explain to people is that wanting a safe space is still not really being willing to fully relinquish your privilege, because you have the privilege to even conceptualize that a space could be safe. Meanwhile, as the Black mother of a Black boy, I know that he is never going to be safe as long as people view the color of his skin as a weapon. That he can be 10 or he can be 20, but that people will be scared and he can lose his life, right? As a trans person who has a gender identity that folks might not understand when they see me, if I use the bathroom that fits with my identity, that requires me to be brave. If I am undocumented and I know that ICE is doing raids, but I still show up to take care of my family, to go to work, to do whatever, that requires bravery. If I am a person with a disability and I have to get to my train so that I can get to work and I can provide for myself, and I know that the station has bad lighting, that people often are peeing and fighting in the elevator, and that's the only way I have to get to where I need to be, then to do that, that requires bravery, right? Like, there are folks who, in order to live every day, to love the way they love, to practice the faith that they practice, Indigenous folks maybe to speak their own language, right? Like, there are ways that folks are brave every single day. And so the fact that people want to have conversations around these issues, but only if a safe space is created, is a slap in the face to folks who every day, to be their authentic selves, have to be brave. And so what we say is that if you really want to confront power and privilege, right? If you really want to figure out where those hidden fences are, then you have to be in a position where you are willing to be brave, not just safe. And when you are brave, you open yourself up and you are vulnerable. And you understand that there is such historical trauma, and that there are things that are going to come into the conversation, and you honor those things. You honor those things. You create some space for dignity and atonement. You allow folks to speak their truth, even if it's not your truth. To Veronica's point, just because something doesn't directly impact you or it hasn't happened to you doesn't mean it's not true. And so you have to allow for folks to speak their truth. You have to listen deeply. Too many of us listen to respond, not to understand. And in a brave space, you have to be listening to understand. You can't always be thinking of what's going to come next. And then I think, the last thing I would say is you have to understand that there are some limits to your expertise. There's going to be some things you know and some things you don't know, and everybody in that space is going to be the same way. And so you are going to make mistakes. I am a bicycle advocate, and I always say, when we're teaching folks how to ride bikes, we always say, well, if you fall off, you got to get back on, right? Especially when you're a kid learning how to ride a bike, when you're an adult learning how to clip in for the first time, you got to get back on, you got to keep going. And I think we have to have that same generosity in these brave spaces where you are going to make mistakes. If you are doing it right, you're probably going to reach a point where you realize the limit of your expertise, you're hitting it, and you're going to say something wrong. So how are you generous with yourself, and how are you generous with others, and how are you brave enough to still speak and not be so scared that you're going to say the wrong thing that you don't, or that you do say the wrong thing? This is a classic thing white folks do. They say the wrong thing, and then when they say the wrong thing, they say, well, I just can't say anything because you're going to be mad at me, person of color, woman, Black, right? And like, no, that's in your own head. That's your own fragility. You have to learn that you are going to make mistakes. Even though you're going to make mistakes, you say it anyway, and you have to hold yourself accountable to keep pushing. And so that's how we want folks to think about a brave space.
That is so awesome. Definitely Odetta and Veronica jump in to talk about this, and then we'll talk a little bit about the section on power. I just wanted to add, you know, this question of stepping down from your role as an expert is like a really hard one, especially when you've done all the schooling and you've learned all the techniques, and you're really just, you know, I've got to, you know, and this idea that if I can ask more questions, I am somehow demonstrating expertise. You know, I think that's, you got to be prepared that your ability to, some of us might frame that as curiosity and not miss that it can be invasive, right? Or that you're taking up, you know, too much conversation with your need to ask more questions. So it's a really, I think the Brave Space section is a really powerful call to learn about yourself, right? You've got to commit that that's an important journey. And, you know, leading a group like the Transformation Alliance, one of the things I've begun to say is, you know, we're definitely focused on racial equity. We are a space that's going to make, you know, normalize saying the words white supremacy, right? And kind of getting people to say these things and be brave about that, but also acknowledging that everybody has got some kind of journey to take towards allyship. And it's not my job to tell you what your journey is, but I expect you to take it, right? And we will find tools or strategies and moments to learn more on how to be a better ally in whatever direction you need to grow in. So we're here to talk, you know, you will hear, you know, the four of us discuss race a lot because it is so absolutely central to our experience. But it could be that you are supposed to be on a journey about accepting trans people or accepting, you know, non-gender conforming people, or maybe you need to be a better ally to women. You know, whatever your journey is, Brave Space can be created to take that journey, and the world kind of needs you to take it. Odetta or Veronica, anything real quick to add on the Brave Space section? And if not, we could go with Veronica to talk a little bit about power and how, as a designer and a transportation professional, you see power acting out in your work, but also what can we operationalize to rebalance it?
Yeah, so I will say this, I'm going to start off with power is a spectrum. And I say that because what tends to happen, especially now in this world of 2020, where people are paying attention to things that many of us have been saying for decades, you know, there's this power, it can feel overwhelming, like, whoa, white supremacy. It's this big, huge structure, and it's so overwhelming. And, oh, you know, we just need to go fix the government, right? And then all this stuff will trickle down. But part of what we came up with the questions and the framework, power can also be something that's very small, like when you hold a public meeting. You know, that is, you know, if the problem you're trying to solve is we don't have a reflection of the community at our public meetings, that's a very small question. It's a very small thing that as a planner, you might have control over because that's your project. And then beginning to really work through, okay, well, how do I solve this problem? How do I use the power that I have over this particular project to begin to solve this problem? The power thing could be the fact that there's turnover in your group. Why are all the Black people leaving my company? Right? So that is a problem. And we can define that and say, this is you know, and that's what the framework does, is what is the problem you're trying to solve? The problem is our company, our group, our team, whatever, isn't diverse. Or whenever we hire people, they leave. So is it a them or is it an us? And it is probably an us, not us, Veronica, us, but us as you as your company, us. But, you know, really trying to understand, why are you having that turnover? Are you creating an environment that people actually want to work in, that they feel welcome? Are there, I don't even like the word microaggressions, but, you know, are there little things that make people feel excluded? Because I will tell you, and Tamika talked about this in her introduction about, you know, code switching. Black people, we constantly code switch, and it is exhausting because we live in two worlds. You know, there's a lot of documentation around that double consciousness. We live in America, which is largely designed for white people. It is designed for white people to be successful. We live in it every day. We go in rooms every day where we can count the number of us that are in the room. That is the world that we live in. We understand all the celebrity gossip coming out of your world. We understand it. But we also have our own world that oftentimes people don't take an interest in. You know, we talk about Twitter, and you know, people will use content that comes out of Black culture, and they're like, oh, it's Twitter culture. And we're like, no, it's Black culture. Those are the things that we are doing, we are talking about, we are thinking about in the world that we live in. And that becomes exhausting. So anywho, back to the power. You know, the questions are not to give you the answer, because the answer, you know the answer, you just don't want to acknowledge the answer. And so coming up with the questions is for you to really be thoughtful and sit down and figure out, what is the problem I'm trying to solve, and why has this problem not been solved in the past? Is it a skill or is it a will? And then beginning to like break that down. If it's a skill issue, okay, what training, what do we need to do to fix the skill? But largely it's a will issue. And so why, what's the will? What is causing, you know, what is causing the what? What's the what? Is like, what's the root of the root? And so that is really how we want you to use that framework. And again, it could be a big systemic problem of, you know, why are all the Black people dying on the roads in my community, right? Or it can be a very small problem of, why are there no Black people showing up at my public meeting? And so really thinking about it, whatever the problem is, take it through the framework and it'll get to the answer that is going to be your aha moment.
Thank you, Veronica. One of the things that really stayed with me when we talked about power was when we started flipping some of the things and saying, who's benefiting from not solving this problem, right? Or who, you can observe who stays exactly the same no matter what we do to the air quotes problem. That's usually a signal that you're looking at somebody who holds power and is in some way either setting the system up to work for them, or have just kind of like taken their place, right? Taken up their role in the system set up by their ancestors to work for them. Odetta, of course, either to respond to a little bit on the power section, but let's move now to talking a little bit about privilege and the privilege section of our framework. And Odetta, all of this amazing research work that you do and how you really spend your days thinking about bringing community expertise, right? And redefining what an expert is and who has the privilege of defining that. Could you talk to that a little bit, and again, how we can use this framework to analyze and interrogate privilege in some of the work, especially research?
Mm-hmm. But before you do that, can you just jump in just a little bit on the power piece? I've heard you speak so powerfully about, again, that picture of folks trying to look over the fence to see the baseball game, and how who has the power to determine what it is your ultimate goal is. Could you add that in? Because I do think we want folks to understand the difference between having power with people and having power over people, and whether or not those who are most impacted by what decisions are made have the power to set the decisions. And I do think that's important. We've seen some of the questions. Somebody specifically asked for examples about where we've seen organizations empower communities. And I think it's even thinking about our language, the fact that the word empower is colonial, right? Who's determining who has the power to bestow it upon others? How do we instead think about co-powering? So maybe if you can lead in with how you dissect that picture, because I really appreciate that.
Sure, Tamika. Thank you for the invitation to share in that way. I think that again, you know, I'm an organizer. All power to all the people, and what I grew up hearing in that mantra is the ability to enact your will to all the people, right? Like that is inherent. So when we talk about self-determination, when we talk about communities having power, it's their ability to self-determine, to go to and become in life the things that they desire to become, to do the things that they desire to do, to enact the decisions and the will of their constituency, of their population, right? That is what power is. And so Tamika and I talk about this a lot. You know, when you look at that diagram of the children standing on the boxes, this is from the perception of a person who says those children have a role. And their role and their aspiration in life is to see this game. But what we really want, and if you were to ask those children, they would say, no, I'm going to be the next, you know, Michael Jordan. I'm going to be the next LeBron James, I'm going to be the owner of the franchise. Actually, I'm the mayor of this city, and I just came and, gave the opening pitch at this game. I am the vendor who provides all the peanuts to every fan all season. I own, the bar across the street where these fans regularly come and watch these games, right? And so power is the ability to decide what people can aspire to and what role they play in life. And so this framework is aimed to get us to think about who is deciding that on behalf of communities, particularly in our planning practices. When we look at neighborhoods and say, okay, this is designated to be a developing place. This is going to be a transient place. This place is going to be a hub for industry. This place is going to be the place where people who are new to the country come and then they leave, right? We're making all of these decisions about what entire neighborhoods and cities should be and their function and role in society. And we often make them because of what we have measured in the past and the result that we desire to get in the future. And so I think, that bridges nicely to talk about the last section of the framework, which is privilege. And privilege, I think, brings together everything that Tamika and Veronica have so nicely laid out. Privilege here in our framework is defined as an unearned advantage. And oftentimes we think of that as having privilege over another ambiguous random person, group of people in society, right? But privilege shows up in our everyday lives and it shows up in our work. It's both attached to all of our identities and our roles. And they are with respect to people who we share air, space, water, right? Income with, right? And so we all have different privileges associated with our identities. If you are able-bodied, right, you have a privilege over a person in that stadium, than a person who is not able-bodied. If you speak a particular language, you have a privilege to be able to hear, understand, and communicate in certain settings that other people do not, right? And so part of this is holding that brave space, making it a daily mindset and framework with which you sit at the table to say, what are my inherent advantages just because of who I am in this setting? And a lot of times that's really hard in planning practices because we are having those conversations and we're not sitting next to the person who we have privilege over. And so it's really easy to go like, all of our identities are the same. I don't have privilege over anybody. We're kind of all the same at this table. And the two community representatives at the table of 16, or, the 22 people who showed up to the meeting that Veronica talked about, who commented on this project, when one of our staff members was there and then they brought us back the memo, we don't have privilege over them, but it's really important to understand role and identity as vehicles for analyzing your privilege. And in particular for me, I'm a researcher. So I run a study called the Healthy Neighborhood Study, which looks at the impacts of transit-oriented development and change processes, the way that it changed places on people's health and well-being. And one of the biggest privileges that we have as planners and scientists is deciding what is valid and deciding what success looks like. Everything we measure exists inside of a framework that says we are measuring this to know whether something is bad or good, whether something causes one thing or another. And that framework, that perspective comes out of our privilege, our advantage in life to stand on the balcony or stand on the dance floor, or how we see things. And so in transit-oriented development, a lot we'll look at how many jobs did we create? What's the density of housing? How close geographically are these new jobs to this particular neighborhood? And we don't think about or require to measure who do these things benefit. Do the people who are already there actually connect with these things? And when they do connect with them, do they improve the health for those people? We can say we have the privilege to be able to say we are going to define our scorecard based on county level data or statewide data in a region, right? Or zip code level data. That's a privilege. People who live in a particular block or a neighborhood don't have the ability to say, I'm going to see myself outside of where I live. right? And so when we measure success, we also can think about, we may track trends over time and say, we are going to measure our success and impact on health based on something like diabetes rates, but we don't disaggregate that data to say, did the population level improvements that we saw from this intervention happen at the mean, or did they happen at the margin? Did they happen for the people who are normal, for whom, all of these things were designed exactly for them, for the people who are kind of like in the mean, who are already included, or did this initiative actually include those who were excluded? Did it bring about equity, right? And so in our work, examining what we do and how we do it, what's the data that we use to inform it, how we define success and who we invite to define success is really critical. And I think, Odetta, if I may, I see a few questions coming through in the chat, and folks are asking for, in particular, examples of how we might apply these things in community engagement. One of the biggest things that I'm an advocate of, particularly around planning and transportation, is having community define what a development plan would do for them to call it successful. What would be different in their everyday lives for them to say that this planning initiative was successful? I learned through our work, we hear people say like, well, transportation should connect me to who and what matters in my life, the people I need and the things that I need. And the question back to them is then what would you expect for that to do for your health? Oh, I would definitely be less stressed out. I would have stronger relationships. I would have fewer financial trade-offs, right? And then you can build a measurement framework that actually considers the health and well-being of people who were not previously included in that plan, right? And so having people, as Veronica said, at the table at the beginning, who are you inviting to frame success? Who are you inviting to tell you what to measure? All of those things are opportunities to share, to check our privilege and share power back with communities and give them the right and the position to decide and enact their will through our planning processes.
Hey, Odetta, thank you for jumping in on some of the participant questions too. I just wanted to throw in, so Transformation Alliance had a really interesting experience some years back now, where we were partnering with our transit agency, MARTA, here in Atlanta. And first of all, MARTA was very vulnerable with us, frankly, and said, we don't do community engagement, and we're starting this TOD program around all of our transit stops. How can we do this better? And our arts and culture kind of lead member at the time created a process that they called En Route, which is a play on ROUTE, right? And they convened community volunteers, people who kind of self-selected, to meet, every week for, I think, about 6 weeks. And they talked about their neighborhood, right? They talked about the history, what they loved about it, how they felt about each other. And there were artists in the room. Part of the En Route program was an arts and culture-based approach, right? Those artists just listened to those themes and those discussions, and then interpreted that art, those themes into a piece of art that ended up going on. There were 4 participants, and so 4 MARTA stations received murals that reflected the artist's interpretation of the themes and the history and the connection that people expressed in those community meetings. But then we also kind of compiled that information and said, a need for places to get together. Folks wanted more food access. They wanted more green space. They were worried about the sidewalks. Those were kind of compiled and delivered to the transit agency to impact their RFP, so that they could at least include in their RFP a sense of what features in a development project would help the community feel it was for them. And the further piece, this is like a great multi-solve, right? Like the lessons just kept pouring out of this moment of honesty from the community and vulnerability from the transit partner. So hence brave space, right? You got to create brave space to let people tell you what they really need. Then we, as an alliance, learned that these things that the community want, there's no money to pay for that. Y'all may want X, Y, and Z things. There is low-income housing tax credits and banks to help pay developers to do that. So we could, and that influenced our advocacy for, a living transit fund is what we were calling it. And it's taken years for that idea to actually start catching traction, and it is just now. But our point always was existing financing will not provide the things that community says they want, that we know they want, because they told us. So we need another financing source that can be used. So I just wanted to jump in and offer kind of a moment from Transformation Alliance, where art and culture created a space that was both safe and brave for community. We needed the bravery of our transit partner to just be vulnerable about what they weren't going to get right. They just acknowledged it and let us fix it with them. And then we just kind of learned, we actually could adjust our advocacy and our focus our work, because we had this moment where the community got together, very generously shared what they were thinking and feeling. So I just wanted to pop that in there, but I think we're up to participant questions now. So
well, yeah. Odetta, the other thing I would add to what you just said, which I think is so key, is that oftentimes when folks want to do equity work, and particularly some of the clients that work within the transportation space, one of their first questions is, well, how can I reallocate resources? And I think that's a conversation worth having. How do we reallocate resources? But often, to do this work, you have to figure out new resources, right? And that's part of what you said, because reallocating resources often is just trying to retrofit equity. And it frankly is more expensive to retrofit something. We all know that. Whether or not you're talking about a home, whether or not you're talking about equity, whether or not you're talking about ability to retrofit something after you have completed it takes more time, takes more money. So it's an argument to do things right the first time, but it's also to say that when you're starting to have this conversation about how you reallocate your resources, you might also want to acknowledge that it's going to take some new resources. That's one point. I think the other thing, you're right, we had some questions pop in, and one of them was, will having more diversity in the planning and design profession help with more equitable transportation? And I would love to hear Veronica's thoughts on that. I think one of my thoughts on that is it depends, right? Because we just had this conversation about power. There is a difference between diversity and inclusion. And folks use the two terms interchangeably, and they are not interchangeable. You can have a super diverse team or group of people, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is inclusive. And Equity 101 says that inclusivity means everybody can show up and be a participant and be their full selves. That's like basic level. You should want that no matter what. True inclusion is when those diverse folks you bring to the table actually have decision-making power. Can they decide things? Can they be the ones who decide how you're reallocating those budgets? Can they set culture? Can they set tone? Do they have decision-making power? Because it's not enough to just diversify. We have to relinquish and redistribute power. And that means the folks who have historically had it need to let go a little bit. And I think that's really, really tough for folks to understand. And so for me, yeah, you should definitely hire more diverse people. But if you're just going to ghettoize them on your outreach team, or if you're just going to have your token DEI hire, who you don't actually include in any decisions, you just inform them afterwards and then ask them to cover for you, that's not really what creates a more equitable transportation system or, frankly, organization.
Yeah, and as we talk about validation, so if you need to read research, Harvard guy has 5011 research papers, Harvard Business Review, whatever they're called. They have all these business stuff that is validating what we are saying. But I will also say, I think, following up what Tamika said, absolutely. I think that not just hiring, because again, you can't hire people and then stress people out when you bring them within your organization, but really hiring people, giving them decision-making authority, listening to what they're saying. And sometimes there may not be data, quote unquote, to back it up other than lived experiences. One of the things that Tamika has talked about early in her introduction is she's always Black, she's always queer. And I just want to reiterate that, is that particularly when you hire diverse people, we are who we are. We don't separate who we are from the world that we operate in. And we're operating in largely a world designed around able-bodied, cisgender white men who are Christian, period. That is what the United States world that we operate in, that is the default. And I think it's for all of us to push to be better. You know, I can even say as an example, I learned that, you know, Twitter, although you can have alt text, the GIFs don't have alt text. You have to be very intentional about it. But guess what? I have the privilege that I can go on Twitter and see everything and be a part of the joke and laugh and ha ha ha. But there are people who are visually impaired who use Twitter that they are excluded from this social media experience because no one took the extra 10 seconds to put in alt text. And so it is about being okay, now I'm conscious of this thing, right? And so that's all that we're saying is that, okay, now that you are conscious, how can I be consciously better in everything that I do? And so does that mean that every single tweet that goes out is going to have alt text? Nope. But I'm doing my best, and I'm trying every time to be conscious. And that's all we're asking. And so when you have in that diverse space, you know, diversity of people, even when you're talking about design, yeah, fine. We have guidance from Americans Disability Act, which came out in 1990. And right now, every city has, you know, roads that are not compliant with the ADA law and are kind of getting there, but not really. And so even then, that's the bare minimum. Like, how do we actually design infrastructure so that if someone is visually impaired, if someone is mobility impaired, if someone who is, you know, for me, I've been really sensitive now that I have a child of moving a stroller, and you realize it is really hard to push a stroller around an urban area or around an area where their sidewalks are either non-existent or not well maintained. But all of that to say is the more diversity of experience that you have amongst your staff, the more all those little things that you might not always be conscious of become conscious. But it's not enough for that person to tell you and you to be like, oh, okay, great point, Tamika, thanks. But it's to actually do it. Okay, I see your point, Tamika. It is a really bad idea to hold this meeting on Wednesday when this particular community is largely Baptist and they have Bible study. Got it, noted. Let's do something different. That's all I got.
We have a few new questions from attendees today. So I'm going to kick this one to you, Tamika and Veronica. And Odetta, please feel free to chime in as well. So what about thinking about power and how you balance? We talk about believing lived experience. How do we think about power differentials when that lived experience stands against equitable development? Particularly thinking of the, you know, not in my backyard movements and or the groups who participate in public comment processes who are more vocal, more visible, more well-resourced, that may block things that stand to benefit communities who are unable to participate in those processes with the same level of resource and power.
So what I have found with a lot of those people is you have to keep asking questions because there's the surface level of what they're telling you, and sometimes there's something else underneath it. And so sometimes the underneath it, quite frankly, is they don't want Black people living in their community. They don't want poor people living in their community, whatever it is, right? So like Montgomery County, Maryland is dealing with this right now with their whole school system where, you know, they're trying to reallocate, you know, they're talking about the potential of looking at the feasibility of changing the school boundaries, which of course is sparking all of these racial conversations where everyone's like, no, it's not racial. I just don't want my kid to, you know, those children are a little bit different, right? And so all those things that come up. So sometimes what is behind that NIMBYism, quite frankly, is racism, classism, and all the other isms that are out there, period. But then also there's sometimes when you start asking questions, I had a project where we were trying to put in a bike lane in a largely Black community. And so it was a group of 3 Black women that pulled me to the side and they were just angry. So I took off my badge and I had to get Ronnie from the block, right? Like I had to like take off the consultant, like I am Veronica, and I had to be Ronnie from the block. And I was like, why y'all mad? Talk to me. What's the what? What is the what? We're not touching parking. We're not doing this. What is the problem, right? And so, but in that having that real conversation with them, when I started just asking questions and asking questions and asking questions and asking questions, what it actually came down to is, hey, I'm actually interested in biking, but I don't really know how to do it. And so, that's really what the root of the problem is. And this thing sounds kind of interesting, but it's not really for me because I don't know how to bike. And it was like, oh, girl, that's the problem. Hold up. I'm the co-founder of Black Women Bike. We got you. Give me your name, your address. I'm going to have people and they're going to hook you up and we go teach you how to ride a bike. Right. And it's something so simple, but they felt excluded. That's really what it came down to in this particular example, because sometimes it's other things. But in this example is that they felt excluded from the process because they couldn't do the thing that we were trying to design for.
Hey,
so,
Veronica, sorry, can I just jump in to say,
yep.
also, you brought your full self to the moment, and that is what helped them connect to you, to tell you the root of the root, right? So this idea that bringing your whole self might actually crack open conversation that you need to be having, and that is not unprofessional. That is actually problem solving, right? Like that will get you the information you need to solve the problem or finish the project at a higher level of quality. When you were able to be Ronnie and let them connect to you, and the point is not to put on a persona that is not truly yours. It's to be who you are. People can tell when you're not being authentic, and they will stay in their shell until you come out of your shell, whatever that shell looks like. So I just want to point out that, the thing we've been saying about bringing your whole self to your work is not so much about giving up professionalism to do it. It is actually a way you get information to accomplish your goals.
Yeah, I think far too often folks like to come at us as Black women. And a question earlier was, did women in other parts of the world have the same? Yeah, when we talked to women of color from other countries, they were like, yes, it's the same for me. And I think people like to come at us. And one of the number one complaints about Black women is that we are unprofessional or that we're overly emotional and that we just don't know how to do something. And the reality is we might do things differently than how you do them, but it doesn't mean it's not professional. It doesn't mean it's not strategic. It doesn't mean it's not thoughtful. And we're able to still get things done. And so I think often our intelligence is insulted because folks come to this realization that we can do everything they can do in the same way they can do it, but they can't do everything we can do. And it's not, in their mind, it's like, well, I'm just not Black. And that is a cop-out because I'm not white. But when y'all start talking about NPR, I started listening to NPR. When y'all started using all these words, like I started looking up the words, right? Because I've worked at it. Just like if I was gonna run a marathon, I would train. I wouldn't just go out there and be like, let's do this marathon, I'm ready day one. And I also wouldn't be like, if it was something that I really cared about, if it was something that really mattered to me, I wouldn't just go out there and say, I'm not a runner. If I wanted to do it, I would get myself in a position where I can do it. Because at the end of the day, what we have to realize is you're not gonna solve your equity problems in transportation with a diversity hire, or with the task force, or with the flashy statement the next time a Black name hashtags. Like that's not gonna solve these problems. It takes leadership and it takes will. It takes will of leaders to make this change. And you have to absolutely remember that. So it's not enough to just say, well, we keep having meetings, but only the NIMBYs show up. Where are your meetings at? What time are your meetings? Are y'all providing food at these meetings? Are you providing childcare? Are you having the same meetings at city halls when so many of us have been taught for so long that that's not a place for us? Or are you saying, I want to know what people think about transit, and I work at an agency full of people who provide transit but don't actually take transit? And so when I have this meeting in our fancy building, the only people who are coming are X. Well, why not get on the bus and talk to people on the bus? Why not go to that 3-on-3 basketball tournament this weekend in your neighborhood? It's because we have to get out of doing things the way we always do them. And we can't just rely on the people of color we hire to do that work, because I can tell you right now, y'all are not paying us enough for that.
And can I just add one more thing to that, though? And this goes back to asking the question to understand what is the will that group is trying to enact, be them in support of, a NIMBY movement, or be they women who feel excluded from bike lanes. We have to be brave enough to ask those questions, and we have to turn the dial back on ourselves and say, well, we're all people. We know what makes us show up in the midst of our busy day to a meeting, right? Like, we have access and we care about it. And so solve one of those problems for those groups of people and ask yourself, why am I not asking my director, my client, whoever it is who's holding these meetings, why they are doing it in this way? What am I afraid that I will lose? Am I willing to be brave and not be safe and have them say, oh, you are a disruptive person, you are not supporting this, I'm going to get into a conflict with my client? What is it that we are avoiding, or the privilege or power that we are trying to protect, the places where we are not being brave in our practice when we see something that is not working? Even asking the question, why is it acceptable to you, client or director, that there are only 5 people at this meeting? Even reflecting that question back. But we have to examine what type of bravery we need to ask that question and what we think we'll be losing, right? In order to move from ally to accomplice, in order to interrogate our own power and privilege and use it in service of equity. So I think, Odetta, we've got 3 minutes. Did you want to walk us through some closing remarks?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you all so much. I hope this has been helpful. Our goal is not always to populate our discussion with lots of examples, because especially this webinar, we know people know how to research things. So we commend to you the internet, Al Gore's internet, to find what you need to find. But we can also share things that have helped us, maybe on the archive page and such. I'm just so grateful to all of my beautiful friends for spending some time with me today. And if we could just do like a quick wrap up from each of you, and then Dan, maybe you'll jump in and do the final wrap up on the whole event for us. So let's go Veronica, Odetta, Tamika, and then Dan. Hey.
Is that your daughter, Odetta?
Yeah, Adria says hi, everybody.
Hey. So my final thought is really take a look at the framework and be serious. You know, instead of feeling like it's just this big, you know, elephant problem, take your problem and walk it through the framework and see what you come out with.
And I would just add to that, walk through the framework with the people that you are in service of, right? Like, do it with partners. And the place where you get stuck, or the place where you're like, maybe I shouldn't say this, that's the fence. And that's the thing that you should work on.
And then I promise to later come back to this piece about the difference between an ally and accomplice. And I think Odetta actually just did it when she talked about, you know, people not wanting to be the ones who are viewed as problematic, are always speaking up, and they don't want to lose their steam or their friends. Know that everybody on this panel, know that the folks of color, the queer folks, the folks with disabilities, the indigenous folks, the folks who are members of a press group in your professional setting, they have risked something. They have absolutely risked something when they show up, when they speak up, and when they do their work. And so, you know, yes, be an ally. We appreciate allies, but see if you can up your game and become an accomplice. Know that we are willing to risk something, and ask yourself, what are you willing to risk?
Right. And this is Dan. I just, all I have to say is thank you all so much for your remarks, your perspectives, sharing it with us today, and kicking off this series. I think the remainder of the panelists have a lot of work to do to compare to this first episode, but I hope everyone will tune in and register for those. Final word is just to say thank you, Odetta, Veronica, Tamika, and Odetta for sharing your perspectives with us today. And for all of you, please join us next time. We're going to be back on Thursday. All of this material is available to you. I'll send you an email later today with all the details. So thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.